And here we come to a little bit of kind of fate tipping things the right direction. The orcs have an argument, mostly about whether or not to kill the prisoners. There turns out to be a couple of different camps among the orcs. So Aragorn's suspicions are confirmed, and there are some Moria orcs who are they're there to avenge the orcs the company killed while they were in Moria. We're introduced here to Ugluk, the Uruk-hai from Isengard, but there's another voice that stands out to Pippin, and even among the other orc voices he hears, this one is particularly noted as evil. This is Grishnak. Hello everybody, welcome to Aude and Tulava, where we are walking our way through Tolkien's Legendarium, looking for new insights and a greater understanding of the works we all love. Today we are in chapter 3 of book 3, the Uruk-hai. As we get started, of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, grab a version of the books you don't have in the description below, or join the channel membership community if you'd like to help support the channel that way. And of course, we do have our ongoing partnership with Chapters Tea and Coffee. Chapters spring from a passion for story. They set out to elevate the stories we all love by teaming up with independent artists to hand draw beautiful imagery and pair it with specially selected artisanal tea. My favorite, of course, is Second Breakfast. Go to drinkchapters.com/Huron and use code Huron15 to get 15% off. I do, of course, earn a small commission from every bag sold, so thank you in advance. It's a great way to sit down and enjoy the books we all love. That's drinkchapters.com/Huron and use code Huron15 to get 15% off. All right, let's dive in. The previous chapter ended with the three hunters sleeping on the edge of an ancient forest with no horses and having found no sign of Merry and Pippin. But chapter 3 starts immediately with Pippin. Pippin lay in a dark and troubled dream. It seemed that he could hear his own small voice echoing in black tunnels, calling, "Frodo, Frodo!" But instead of Frodo, hundreds of hideous orc faces grinned at him out of the shadows. Hundreds of hideous arms grasped at him from every side. Where was Merry? He woke. Cold air blew on his face. He was lying on his back. Evening was coming and the sky above was growing dim. He turned and found that the dream was little worse than the waking. His wrists, legs, and ankles were tied with cords. Beside him Merry lay, white-faced, with a dirty rag bound across his brows. All about them sat or stood a great company of orcs. If you were to do the transition between these two chapters visually, it'd be at the end of the old chapter, a slow fade to black. And you hear Pippin calling for Frodo from far away while slowly fading in to a black tunnel. And then orc faces would appear in the shadows with arms reached out and grasping. Pippin desperately trying to tear away from them. And suddenly he would awake, his head lying on green grass, sweat dripping down his forehead. At least that's kind of how it happens in, the movie playing in my head while I read the book. It's a little jarring coming from the more subtle, ominous tones of the previous chapter. And it brings me back kind of a little bit to the Barrow Downs, calling Frodo, except now we're flipping the script and we're seeing it from Pippin's perspective instead of Frodo's perspective, which is actually a great time to bring up the epistemic regime again. Remember, the epistemic regime is basically how we know what's being told to us. What does the narrator know? And what we see in The Lord of the Rings is the point of view is oftentimes from the person with the least knowledge in that moment, at least assuming Frodo and Pippin aren't in the same place. It's more obvious in some places than others, like when Gandalf and Pippin go to meet Denethor for the first time, but we can see as we start this chapter, it's mostly going to be from Pippin's point of view. And this is where the interlacing happens. We just got 2 chapters about Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, and now we finally get to the story about Merry and Pippin. And Tolkien does a really cool thing here. He reminds us of what we learned at the beginning of chapter 1. Boromir tells Aragorn he saw the orcs bind the hobbits and take them. They weren't killed. We all probably kept this in the back of our minds during the last chapter, but we may have kind of forgotten that the orcs tied them up. Well, this is obviously our reminder. And that last sentence is one you may think is completely innocuous. I was in that boat too, until I read The Lord of the Rings alongside Hammond and Skull's Reader's Companion. I mean, orcs have been mentioned plenty of times in the book so far. We've heard a recap of Bilbo's story, Legolas told us about the orc attack in Mirkwood, and obviously they fought a bunch of orcs in Moria. Not to mention orcs attacking Boromir and Parthgalen. But this is the first time that we are with the orcs. The first time the orcs aren't trying to actively kill the members of the company. So with that in mind, I'm guessing why they decided to talk about this in this spot, Hammond and Skull decided to write 2.5 pages about the origins of orcs and the problems with orcs. So let's kind of at least attempt to do an abbreviated, but hopefully still thorough explanation of the issues that arose because of Tolkien and the way he wrote his orcs. And if you want a more in-depth talk about the orcs and their redeemability, check out Girl Next Gondor's video right here. It's super, super good. So in The Road to Middle-earth, author Tom Shippey says, there can be little doubt that the orcs entered Middle-earth originally just because the story needed a continual supply of enemies over whom one needed feel no compunction. the infantry of the old war, to use Tolkien's phrase, from monsters. We will also later hear Treebeard say the orcs were created in mockery of the elves, and Frodo will also later say, the shadow that bred them can only mock, it cannot make, not real new things of its own. I don't think it gave life to the orcs, it only ruined them and twisted them. And if they are to live at all, they have to live like other living creatures. Combine that with what Christopher Tolkien put in the Silmarillion, stating, but of those unhappy ones who were ensnared by Melkor, little is known of a certainty. Yet this is held true by the wise of Erisea, that all those of the Quendi who came into the hands of Melkor ere Utumno was broken, were put there in prison, and by slow arts of cruelty were corrupted and enslaved. And thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the orcs in envy and mockery of the elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes. We also see Aule creating the dwarves in the Silmarillion. Until Eru hallows them and gives them their souls, they're unable to do anything by themselves and stand insensate when Aule's attention is not directly focused on them. All this would lead one to just kind of go with the Silmarillion's version and say they're corrupted elves, and I believe that was kind of canon basically for a while, at least until Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien and History of Middle-earth came out. In letter 144, Tolkien tells Naomi Mitchison the orcs must be corruptions, since they are servants of the Dark Power and later of Sauron, neither of whom could or would produce living things. I guess it's no surprise to anyone here that people started to question that. If Sauron or Morgoth couldn't create any sentient being, wouldn't the orcs be redeemable? Couldn't they turn to the light, as it were? Tolkien worked on correcting this before his death, as we see in Morgoth's Ring, which is Volume 10, History of Middle-earth. And that does seem to work together with his Christian beliefs. In letter 153, Tolkien replies to kind of that question. So in this myth, it is feigned, legitimately whether that is a feature of the real world or not, that he gave special sub-creative powers to certain of his highest created beings. That is a guarantee that what they devised and made should be given the reality of creation. Of course, within limits, and of course subject to certain commands or prohibitions. But if they fell, as the diabolist Morgoth did, and started making things for himself to be their lord, these would then be, even if Morgoth broke the supreme ban against making other rational creatures like elves or men. They would at least be real physical realities in the physical world, however evil they might prove, even mocking the children of God. They would be Morgoth's greatest sins, abuses of his highest privilege, and would be creatures begotten of sin and naturally bad. I nearly wrote irredeemably bad, but that would be going too far. So it would seem Tolkien was leaning towards Morgoth being able to create wholly separate beings and give them capital L life until you read Morgoth's Ring. Yet this is held true by the wise of Erisea, that all those who of the Quendi came into the hands of Melkor ere Utumno was broken were put there in prison and by slow arts of cruelty and wickedness were corrupted and enslaved. Thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the orcs in envy and mockery of the Eldar, for the Orcor had life and multiplied after the manner of the children of Iluvatar, and naught that had life of its own, not the semblance thereof, could ever Melkor make. So, because Tolkien couldn't really reconcile a race of beings that were completely irredeemable, he had them come from corrupted elves, which itself poses a bunch of other questions. If they bred like elves, where were the female orcs? If they came from elves, are orcs immortal, or at least serially longeval? Do their souls or Fea go to the halls of Mandos, where their bodies, their Hroa, are destroyed? If they were initially good beings and were corrupted or brainwashed, how immeasurably corrupt must they be for their corruption to just last thousands upon thousands of years and untold generations to the time of the War of the Ring or Lord of the Rings, where we are now? So Unfinished Tales possibly gives us an out, stating the orcs were possibly corrupt Druidine. But Hammond and Skull closed their explanation, saying the letter in the later 1950s, Tolkien began toying with the idea that men were the origin of orcs due to possible changes in the cosmology of Middle-earth. But that was as he was trying to get the Silmarillion together enough to try and publish it, and as we know, he just never got there. So us giant nerds are just out here wondering how to fit orcs kind of into the Legendarium correctly. So there's all of that. But all of that to say, orcs are bad guys in this story. Feel free to keep them in your mind as essential canon fodder for now. Just understand that the deeper you go, as honestly with most things Tolkien, the more complicated it gets. But I guess that's really why we're all here and why we love this so much. Okay, getting back to the tale at hand, we can see Pippin's memory coming back to him. He remembers running after Frodo until he and Merry ran into a few orcs. Luckily, they both had their barrow blades, and eventually Boromir came to defend them. Then Boromir had come leaping through the trees. He had made them fight. He slew many of them, and the rest fled. But they had not gone far on the way back when they were attacked again by 100 orcs at least, some of them very large, and they shot a rain of arrows, always at Boromir. Boromir had blown his great horn till the woods rang, and at first the orcs had been dismayed and had drawn back, but when no answer but the echoes came, they had attacked more fiercely than ever. Pippin did not remember much more. His last memory was of Boromir leaning against a tree, plucking out an arrow, then darkness fell suddenly. And this begins really bringing the pieces together for us. We knew Boromir fought the orcs and he said the hobbits got carried away. We now have that confirmed. They were taken and obviously not killed, though we still don't know all the details of where they're going or who the orcs are working for, especially after the hunters found these smaller orcs slaughtered in the last chapter. Pippin, struggling to free himself, is clearly going to be useless, but also draws the attention of a nearby orc who doesn't really seem particularly happy with his current circumstances. "If I had my way, you'd wish you were dead now," said the other. "I'd make you squeak, you miserable rat." He stooped over Pippin, bringing his yellow fangs close to his face. He had a black knife with a long, jagged blade in his hand. "Lie quiet, or I'll tickle you with this," he hissed. "Don't draw attention to yourself, or I may forget my orders." Curse the Isengarders. "Ugluk, Bagronk, Sha Pushtug Saruman Glob, Bubosh Sky." He passed into a long, angry speech in his own tongue that slowly died away into muttering and snarling. Tolkien here doubles down on the rift between different types, the multiple different types of orcs here. What I just noticed while looking at this section is how angry this orc is about the Isengarders not letting him use his knife on Pippin. Appendix F says he is a Mordor orc, and a page later we hear what sounds like another Mordor orc saying his orders were to bring the hobbits back and not served. It doesn't technically say they're supposed to be alive, but that's kind of what it sounds like. So maybe this particular orc doesn't know his orders, or at least the full orders. Hammond and Skull let us know there are a couple translations of the orcish phrase in the Peoples of Middle-earth, which is volume 12 of the History of Middle-earth. None of them make it into Appendix F when Tolkien says the phrase is more debased form of Orcish. It mostly seems like Tolkien wasn't sure exactly what direction he wanted the Orcish language to go. For example, according to Christopher Tolkien, Begronk is used in different translations as either cesspool or like torture chamber. Tolkien never fully fleshed out the whole Orcish language. I totally understand that, considering he was often enthralled by the sounds of words, and the whole language is pretty ugly. It matches what we see in the books of the orcs. Ugly. He was much more aesthetic about his languages than that. And here we come to a little bit of kind of fate tipping things the right direction. The orcs have an argument, mostly about whether or not to kill the prisoners. There turns out to be a couple of different camps among the orcs. So Aragorn's suspicions are confirmed, and there are some Moria orcs who are they're there to avenge the orcs the company killed while they were in Moria. We're introduced here to Ugluk, the Uruk-hai from Isengard, but there's another voice that stands out to Pippin, and even among the other orc voices he hears, this one is particularly noted as evil. This is Grishnak. And as the conversation wears on, Ugluk decides they all must stick together if they want to make it out of Rohan, which is full of foul rebels and brigands. "Aye, we must stick together," growled Ugluk. "I don't trust you, little swine. You've got no guts outside your own sties. But for us, you'd all have run away. We are the fighting Uruk-hai. We slew the great warrior. We took the prisoners. We are the servants of Saruman the Wise, the White Hand, the hand that gives us man's flesh to eat. We came out of Isengard and led you here, and we shall lead you back by the way we choose. I am Ugluk. I have spoken." "You have spoken more than enough," Ugluk sneered the evil voice. "I wonder how they would like it in Lugburs. They might think that Ugluk's shoulders needed relieving of a swollen head. They might ask where his strange ideas came from. Did they come from Saruman, perhaps? Who does he think he is, setting up on his own with his filthy white badges? They might agree with me, with Grishnak, their trusted messenger, and I, Grishnak, say this. Saruman is a fool, and a dirty, treacherous fool. But the great eye is on him. Swine, is it? How do you folk like being called swine by the muckrakers of a dirty little wizard? It's orc flesh they eat, I'll warrant." And with those words, a fight breaks out. We can assume this is the fight that led to the orc bodies the hunters discovered in the last chapter, and this is where I see fate stepping in. The others gave way and one stepped backward and fell over Merry's prostrate form with a curse. Yet that probably saved his life, for Ugluk's followers leaped over him and cut down another with their broad-bladed swords. It was the yellow-fanged guard. His body fell right on top of Pippin, still clutching its long, saw-edged knife. Now, thought Pippin, if only it takes that ugly fellow a little while to get his troop under control, I've got a chance. A gleam of hope had come to him. The edge of the black knife had snicked his arm and then slid down to his wrist. He felt the blood trickling onto his hand, but he also felt the cold touch of steel against his skin. For the moment, Pippin was unwatched. His legs were securely bound, but his arms were only tied about the wrists, and his hands were in front of him. He could move them both together, though the bonds were cruelly tight. He pushed the dead orc to one side, then hardly daring to breathe, he drew the knot of the wrist cord up and down against the blade of the knife. It was sharp, and the dead hand held it fast. The cord was cut. Quickly, Pippin took it in his fingers and knotted it again into a loose bracelet of 2 loops and slipped it over his hands. Then he lay very still. This is the beginning of Pippin's smartest sequence in the entire book. He may do other things that are smart or brave, but as far as I'm concerned, this is by far the best. And I'm dying on that hill. Pippin doesn't just try to cut all his bonds and run away. He was cool under pressure for once. He only cut the bonds around his hands and then retied them just looser. This, I would say, is a very un-Pippin-like thing to do. Why did he do it? Am I to think all the time in like the boats totally mellowed him out and he's like thinking clearly now? He's probably just that much more mature than the Pippin in Moria. Honestly, I don't really think so. I think this is fate. I think it's Eru, honestly, stepping in and giving him calm, peace. It says in the section we just read, a gleam of hope had come to him. Could it be that he gained some Amdir in this situation? Maybe. After being knocked out, carried for miles, and having to listen to an evil race of creatures talking about killing him or torturing him, he gets a gleam of Amdir. I think it's Eru giving it to him. Fate intervening to have that orc fall where it needed to. And on top of that, Eru giving Pippin the clear-headedness to do the right thing in that moment and be patient. I will die on this hill. I'll say it again. This is Pippin's best sequence of events in the entire book. And what happens next, we will have to see next time. This is where we're going to wrap up for today. I'm trying to have these videos just be a touch shorter to help with the production cycle so I can make sure I get everything out on time for everyone. Of course, it just means we'll probably have more videos than originally planned once we finish the book. I was initially thinking I would just do 1 video per chapter, and that didn't work out very well either, so we'll see where it goes. But with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, buy a new version of the book you don't already have in the description, or join the channel membership. Don't forget to claim your 15% off chapters, tea, and coffee. The book and these videos are best enjoyed with a lovely beverage on hand. And until next time, always remember, out into the day shall come again.